Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Stories from Starry Skies. This week's story is hopefully a little bit of an action adventure, a little bit. I really enjoyed writing this story, like I do all of them. I'm continually fascinated by the ways in which the story unfolds in the detail. And I was thinking about how I'm writing these stories. And coming from a background of 3D rendering and animation, especially in the old days, each render of a scene from a 3D program would start off blurry, and then the next pass would add a little detail, and the next pass add a little bit more detail, and so on and so forth until you had a final image. And I've been thinking how that is applying to my writing process. Where I am in the process right now with the book is writing a detailed timeline, and I'm coming to the end of that. I have about probably another quarter of the book to go. And that's like the first very rough rendering of the story, and it's still very blurry and not very distinct, but you can kind of see where everything is going to be, kind of like general areas of color and basic shapes. And then the stories that I'm doing for this channel, they start out that way as well. To a general timeline, or it's not really a formal outline, but it's just a sequence of events. And then I do another pass on it and actually fill out that outline into sentences and paragraphs and hopefully correct grammar. And then I record them for you guys. So these stories are a very rough first pass character sketches. But with the book, there will need to be additional passes, at least one more, if not several more, in which more detail is added and more specifics are provided that really help to fill out the world and the characters, kind of make it sparkle and come alive. So I found that an interesting way of thinking about this process I'm going through. And I'm really excited also about the feedback loop that is happening between these stories and the book. Starting with last week's story and then with this week's story, there are components of the book that I am changing, small detail things that are directly being pulled from these stories. Things like motivations and character arcs and things that I can add into the book that weren't there before but are now. So I hope you all are enjoying this process, trying to be as forthright as I can about where I am in it. And I hope you're enjoying the stories as well. Maybe once I have the book in hand, I will go back and kind of make a few more passes at these stories as well and really polish them up. But for now, they're doing exactly what I was hoping they would do, and that is providing me with a background knowledge of who these characters are, and hopefully helping you all relax, enjoy the stories, and maybe fall asleep or just lower your heartbeat a little bit. So, let's get into this week's story. Daisy Carreri heard the familiar deep rumble that rolled through her neighborhood. From long experience, she knew that she had exactly 4 seconds before she needed to look up to catch the sleek shape of the cargo ship as it lifted above the tree line and made its way far above to rendezvous with an orbiting station or another ship or satellite. She stopped her work on her bike and watched the 5:45 p.m. ship climb upwards and felt the vibrations of its thrust through the soles of her shoes. They were always right on time every day, punctuating her days like clockwork for all of her 14 years. Delays meant extra fuel burnt to catch up to their destination whizzing far above their heads. The next one would lift off at exactly 8:05, and that meant she had to get back to work. She went back to checking the height of her seat on her bike. Daisy was tall for her age and really could have used an adult bike, but she knew that was not going to happen anytime soon. She was a sunset baby, meaning that by the time she was 8, both of her parents had retired, and retirement meant money was tight. It meant that they were frugal as a family, making things last, repairing and repurposing most things in their lives. It also meant that they rented a slightly run-down house only blocks from the spaceport. Satisfied that her seat wouldn't detach itself, even though it was way past its highest safety setting, she made one last check of the rest of her bike. Her mental clock was counting down. She would have to leave soon if she was ever going to cover the 4 blocks to the port. At 5:50, she coasted down the driveway and out into her street. She made an immediate left turn and started her winding path through the neighborhood. She could, of course, taken a more direct route, using larger streets, but Daisy did not want to be picked up on any cameras for this journey. Nothing could get in the way of her plan, the mission that she had assigned herself. It had all started at school several months ago when they had studied spaceflight and took a tour of the port. There had been a large photo on one of the walls that showed a beautiful young woman floating in space. A space station was in the background, and she was obviously going out to repair or work on some part of it. It was a beautiful photo, but the thing that captured Daisy's attention was the look on the woman's face. She looked happy, she looked determined, and she looked at peace. The sunlight bouncing off the earth far below made the woman's dark skin glow, and her wide green eyes sparkle. What must it be like to be her? To be able to fly and float high above the earth. Ever since then, she hadn't been able to get the idea out of her mind. She thought about it constantly and dreamed about the woman in space at night. She had found the same photo in a magazine. It was part of a hiring campaign for the port to sell people on the potential excitement of working in space. The marketing department had spent a lot of time and effort on the campaign, and it was about to be far more effective than they ever imagined. Daisy forced herself to bike at a normal pace. There was no need to rush. She had planned the whole thing. No need to draw any extra attention to herself. The wind in her hair was brisk, and she was glad that she had her heavy jacket on. The houses slid by each other, each looking much like her own. Some had kid toys scattered in the yard. Others had small trees and ornaments to welcome visitors. And some were mostly weeds and bare patches of dirt, but all were homes to families of one sort or another, each making their way as best they could. In a few minutes, Daisy sees her destination up ahead, the Go-and-Go station. Behind it, on the other side of the road, was the port. Closer to the big road, there was a bit more traffic, people coming home from work or after-school activities. She turned up onto the sidewalk for the last few yards and coasted into the back parking lot of the gas station. Step 1 was complete. She pulled back a short stack of pallets leaning against the back wall and rolled her small bike behind them. Its worn, dark blue paint job and rusty handles made it nearly invisible to anyone passing by. She made a final check of her person and her nerves. She takes a deep breath and heads into the store to use the restroom. By the time she's back outside, it was noticeably darker. Dusk had been falling all throughout her trip, and it was now that magical few minutes between when the sunlight was quickly fading and the lights of the city came awake. Soon it would be time to slip through the deepening shadows. Her dark, scruffy jacket and black faded jeans were now the exact same murky gray of the world around her. At 6:57, the security car goes by. It's a bit early, but that's why she got here when she did. Showing up early was a habit she learned from her parents. Like her dad, she liked to scope out a place and live in it for a few minutes before anything was expected of her. As soon as the car is around the bend, she heads across the street to the fence. She mentally checks off another accomplishment, crossing the road before the streetlights came on. She steps off the sidewalk onto the other side and jumps across the small culvert choked with weeds. She heads towards a small clump of bushes along the fence line, keeping low and staying quiet. She knew this spot behind the bushes was safe and hidden from the road and the guard gate in the distance, because there was evidence that someone was currently living here. So she didn't want to hang around for too long. The 7 o'clock guard change was her chance. The patrol car had pulled up, and the two pair of guards were chatting outside the checkpoint booth. They were not watching any monitors. The gap in the fence was probably made by whoever was living behind the bush. Whoever it was could even be working at the port. She fitted through easily and quickly fit herself between two shipping containers that looked like they hadn't been moved in decades and were now permanent fixtures of the landscape. From here, her plan was less solid. She was going to have to improvise for a bit to make her way forward. By 7:05, she had made her way to the far end of two more containers a few rows up. The lights were just starting to come on across the complex, and she could now see the next cargo ship lit up on the pad, waiting for her. She needs to be on board by 7:38 at the latest. She has learned all about the details of cargo ships from her best friend Jenny's dad. He works at the port as a loader, and Daisy has asked him lots of questions ever since she made up her mind to take this trip. She liked Mr. Harbin, and he seemed to be appreciative of someone showing a genuine interest in his work. Jenny was great, but she was more into music and dancing and movies, not machines and computers. It was time to move if she was ever going to make this happen. She had a lot of ground to cover. Her heart racing, she leaves her cover and stays low, sticking to the shadows that are cast by the lights. She weaves her way through the last row of containers and in between a machine shop and a mostly empty warehouse. She darts across the small road and into a more active section of the port. She's now in somewhat more familiar territory. She had been so interested in Mr. Harbin's work that he had given her a tour 4 months ago on a Bring Your Daughter to Work day. He had been so proud finally to bring someone and to show off what he did. She had absorbed every minute of it and been fascinated by the large mechanical movers that he used to move the containers into the compartments on either side of the ship. Each cargo compartment started out flat on the ground to be loaded. The containers were locked into the floor. When it was ready to lift off, the ship pulled up the compartments, rotating them in place and locking them into its body. Daisy had felt very small amongst all the huge equipment and bustling activity, but she loved seeing how it all worked and how it was all controlled. It was 7:12 and time for the trickiest part of her plan. This is where she needed the most luck. She slips through the doors of the livery and walks with purpose down the hall towards the safety supplies room. When she enters, she grabs a hard hat, a high-vis vest, an emergency pressure suit, and a small oxygen breather, just as they had done when she had visited. Luckily, Daisy was tall for her age, and her somewhat bulky frame helped her blend in. She stuffs the folded-up pressure suit underneath her jacket, puts on the hat and the vest, and looks like any other day worker on the job. There's no time to lose. The countdown in her head is still going. She jogs briskly across the remaining stretch of asphalt. Not only is she covering more ground, but she is less likely to be stopped and questioned. She is soon at the loading bay outside of the massive compartment. The workers are putting the last containers into place. She can hear the locking mechanisms clamping down around the large steel dowels embedded in the floor. Others are working on the last inventory checks, and there are still more workers inside the compartment checking the fastenings. They are all dressed like her, so no one gives her a second look. She slips around the side of the loading mech as it pulls out of the space. As she passes a workbench, she picks up a medium-sized tool and holds it so it's easily visible. When she turns around, she nearly bumps into a man walking the other way, entering information into his pad. "Whoa, sorry there," he said, pulling the pad back to avoid hitting her in the head. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you there," she said. She turned to continue into the compartment. He was studying her face too closely. "Where are you going?" Thinking fast, she holds up the tool. "I was told to deliver this inside as quick as I could." He gives her a good long look over, and her youthful features play to her advantage. He decided that she must be an intern or an apprentice, and he waves her on. "Be out of there by the third alarm. You don't want to be stuck in there." "Oh yes," she thinks to herself. "I very much do." She enters the huge compartment. It was like a low but very wide cavern. It holds 2 rows of containers lengthwise, one set along the floor, and a mirror set locked into the ceiling. Soon, the whole thing will rotate 90 degrees, so everything is tightly secured. By this time, all the workers are walking towards the exit, and she is going the other way. She continues to hurry and not make any eye contact. She is sweating in her heavy coat from the exertion and her nerves, but she keeps right on over the threshold and in amongst the giant containers. She is technically in, but now she needs to stay in, and that means hiding. She works her way deep into the grid of containers. The ones clinging to the ceiling hang over her head ominously. There is less room to hide here than she thought there would be. The containers are stacked flush up against each other in each row, with only the occasional aisle between them. She ducks into the 5th one. She feels that she is far enough back and tries to find a spot to hide. The 1st and 2nd alarms have gone off as she was walking, and as she looks around, the 3rd one sounds and the big door slowly rotates up out of the floor to seal her in. It takes several seconds, but soon it is closed and sealed. She can feel the pressure change inside of her ears. She looks at her watch. It is 7:38. Everything is quiet for a short while. She once again feels small, hidden amongst the great Cartesian expanse of the world that is now hers. Suddenly there is a terrifyingly loud boom that reverberates through her, followed by a cacophony of screeching metal. Everything starts to shift and move, and she can tell she is going up, but the floor is also quickly becoming the left-hand wall. She knew this would happen, but it is happening so much quicker than she thought. When standing on the ground from a distance, it always seemed to her to be so slow, almost graceful, but deep inside its belly it is anything but. She reaches out and grabs a conduit running along one of the walls and grips it with all of her strength. As her body rotates around to the new orientation, her weight quickly shifts off of her feet and onto her hands. She wraps her other hand around the pipe, and the tool slips from her grip and tumbles downward, clattering for a long while before coming to a rest far below. She can't stay long like this. She's losing her grip. As the compartment rotates, the rods spaced out on the floor that the containers lock into now form a type of ladder. She is close, but she will have to jump for it. An icy jab of fear stabs through her as she forces herself to let go while she has any hope of gravity working in her favor. She half leaps, half falls, and finally grabs onto the thick metal dowels. It is coated in a thick, gritty grease that makes her purchase difficult. Just as she stabilizes herself, the compartment suffers another tremendous jolt as it comes to rest on the side of the ship. The sudden motion is too much for her to stand, and the metal rung is wrenched from her grasp, and she falls. Her brief scream is lost among the screeching metal and the boom of the huge latches engaging to hold the compartment in place. The aisle she is in is not very wide, so she only falls about 5 feet onto the side, now the top, of the container below her. She hits her side and winces from the pain, but soon finds an opening in the frame to hold on to before the next big jolt thunders through the compartment. The last lock is in place, and her world is more stable. Why did she have to hide so far back? Now, it is a long drop between the containers to the door below her. The lights go out for a brief few seconds, leaving her in complete darkness. When they come back on, they are much, much dimmer. Just enough light to make out her surroundings. She unclips the small oxygen tank and pulls out the emergency pressure suit. She takes off her jacket and her shoes and then slips the pressure suit on over her clothes, seals it up, then puts on her shoes and her jacket with the high-vis vest still around it. In the dim light, she tries to read the instructions on the side of the canister, but she can't read the words. But the pictures make it seem pretty simple. A deep, thrumming sound starts to fill everything around her and permeates her bones. Many stories below, in a deep exhaust pit, the engines of the ship are starting up. The pit, with its many pipes underground, helps to capture the volumes of steam that billow from the engines and dissipate it and cool it so that it does not pose a visibility hazard to the surrounding highways or houses. Daisy sits down and grasps the opening she had found. She can feel the downward pressure of the ship as it lifts off, unwittingly carrying an extra passenger into her dreams. Her heart is racing. I did it, she says to herself. I'm going into space. She allows herself to absorb the moment and remember everything that is happening. The pressure builds, and then slowly the acceleration lessens. She starts to feel everything tilt again. She feels the container pitch forward. She tightens her hand white, but she is still moving. She looks over to see the oxygen tank slowly lift and drift away. She reaches out and grabs it, and as she does, her body slides backwards until her arm, still grasping the container, is fully extended. She clips the container to her belt, but her motion makes her body move even more and starts to twist her arm painfully. Slow movements are best. She steadies herself and looks around at her new world without gravity. She tenuously lets go and tries to be as still as she can, hanging on to nothing. She looks down past her feet into the dimness. The tool she dropped is somewhere down there. She looks back to grab onto the container again, but it is now out of reach. The combination of her small body movements and the slow rotation of the ship have left her drifting. She panics a bit. Her instincts tell her that she should be closer to something secure. She tries swimming, but that has unpredicted effects in 3 dimensions and leaves her spinning and tumbling even more. But she is gradually spinning in an arbitrary direction, and there is not that much wasted space in the compartment. She soon bumps into the containers that used to form the ceiling, and she stabilizes herself. For the next 15 minutes, she practices pushing off of one surface to reach another. She is flying. Eventually, she tries to spin and goes a bit too fast and lands awkwardly against the far wall. She slowly improves, and soon she is zooming up and down the aisles between the containers. The freedom is exhilarating. She imagines herself the beautiful young woman from the photo, bathing in the light of the shining earth. Her giggles, laughs, and whoops echo off the walls. She is a tiny seed of joy, rattling around in the forbidden metal space. After about 30 minutes, in all of her bouncing, she is getting a bit off-kilter and stops to steady herself against the far wall. During the pause, she notices that her feet and legs are starting to feel rather cold. The compartment is sealed and pressurized, but it is not particularly well insulated. The ambient heat is gradually bleeding off into space. She shifts her focus below her and pushes herself downward towards the entrance. The grid structure of the containers slide past her into the gloomy ruby light, but after a while, the door finally comes into view. There, she finds the tool that she dropped and heads towards it. She thinks that she should have worn a jacket with a hood on it, because her head is starting to feel cold as well. She reaches out to grab the tool, but it is freezing cold and covered in frost. In fact, she can just make out the glitter of frost that covers the entire expanse of the door and some of the walls and containers around her. She thinks she can also see her breath, but it's hard to make out in the dim light. She brings her knees to her chest and covers them with her jacket, just as if she is curled up on the couch watching a video. But all the motion sets her to spinning again, and it takes her a few minutes to stop herself. all of the surfaces are very cold, and by the time she has stabilized herself, her hands are like ice. Slowly, she tries again, until she is a small ball, with her hands up inside the opposite jacket arms, hugging her knees, and her face looking down through the neck of her jacket. This at least stops her from shivering. She feels herself gently bumping around and just lets herself float. It's almost enjoyable. While her body drifts, she begins to think about what happens next. She hadn't really thought about it past this moment. She was hoping that she would be able to figure something out once she got this far, but she hadn't planned on it being so cold and so dark. But whatever happens, she knew she would never regret doing this. She closes her eyes to think better. A deep shuddering boom and scraping sound brings her back awake. She lifts her head just in time to make solid contact with one of the containers, bounce along the wall, and then bang into the giant door. The ship had slowed down, but she had not. She tries to get her arms up in time, but they are stiff and slow to move. Her whole body is stiff, and she is very cold. She didn't dare try to extend her arms and legs and lose what little heat she still had trapped in her jacket. The ship came to rest in the docking bay on the construction platform for the new orbiting casino. The large booster engine had separated after it left the atmosphere, allowing the ship to dock and open its cargo bay doors with the compartments still in place. There were no need for mechs here to unload. The crew simply had to release the containers from their position, catalog them, and guide them into the bay using small thrusters attached to each corner. That is why there were several people who witnessed the bundle of a young girl wrapped in a worn puffy jacket and high-vis vest slowly drifting into the cargo bay when the door seated itself into the floor. Daisy was aware that she was drifting again, but she didn't think to look up until she heard the gasps of shock. She looked up and saw a whole crowd looking at her in dumbfounded disbelief. She heard someone calling for a medic, and soon hands were reaching out to stabilize her. They were speaking to her, but she found that she couldn't talk without her teeth chattering so badly that they couldn't understand her. It was several hours before Daisy was able to tell of her adventures. In the end, she only had a mild case of hypothermia. Luckily, she had picked a ship headed into low orbit and not something further out. Once they figured out that she was not a dock worker, but a 14-year-old girl who had just walked into the ship, there was a lot of consternation among the crew. She could hear heated conversations in the next room. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but she could tell they weren't happy. Daisy sat holding a big mug of hot black coffee that they had given her and admitted to herself that she didn't quite get it. Nobody got hurt, and she was the one who chose to get on the ship. And except for getting really cold, her plan had worked perfectly. She wasn't upset for anyone letting her do it, so why were they freaking out so much? She took another small sip of her coffee. This was her first time tasting it, and it really was not that good, but it made her feel very adult, and it was warm, so she powered through it. She looked down at the inky blackness of her drink. She now knew what it felt like, and the nagging curiosity had quieted down. The question had been answered in the only way it truly could be. "I did it," she whispered to herself. "I flew in space." So, I hope you enjoyed that. A little bit of action-adventure. Well, at least adventure. I don't know how much action there was in that story, but I enjoyed writing the story from someone who is singularly focused on one thing and goes for it, but who is 14 and doesn't understand consequences all that well. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're enjoying this series. Please subscribe if you haven't. There will be more stories to come for you. And please leave your comments. Let me know how you think. If you've listened to the stories from the beginning, let me know how you think they're progressing. I really enjoy your feedback. So I will see you next time with another story. Thanks for listening.